Hello, hello, hello. Scott Sambucci here, back. We are chugging along, moving along, cranking along. It's episode number 4 in our Go Farther podcast series. I'm now back in Davis, California. Last week I was in Las Vegas for a conference. Came back with a bit of a cold, but I think I'm already recovered from that. And I'm just excited to be back home in my home studio, back home with the family recording this episode. So let's dig in and talk about the next topic that we're going to talk about, which is obstacles, things getting in the way or slowing you down or potentially stopping you from doing all the things you want to do. So why are obstacles? Why do we want to talk about obstacles when it comes to this concept of go farther? Well, if we want to do more, if we want to be happy, if we want to surprise ourselves, if we want to go farther, then the only way to do that is to choose sometimes the hard path. And the hard path is going to be littered with obstacles along the way. So I think this is important because, we set out to do something, we choose something hard, we choose that one big thing that we're going to go after. And then we get down to, okay, we've made a plan, we're starting to focus, we're starting to make a little bit of progress. We're moving, we're motivated, all those things are starting to crank away. But then obviously we can hit roadblocks, right? We can hit the unexpected. And anything can throw you off course. It could be a big thing, but it could also be a small thing. And what ends up happening, I think, a lot of times is it gets us in a situation where we might start to doubt ourselves. I know I've been in plenty of cases where I've just asked myself, like, am I just being a little too ambitious here? Am I expecting too much from myself? Or did I chew off more? Did I bite off more than I could chew in this, right? Am I even going for the wrong thing in the first place? So, of course, what we need to do is what I know Seth Godin calls this: deal with the dreck. When he talks about writer's block, Seth Godin has often said that the reason that writers have writer's block is they don't want to deal with the dreck, meaning that you have to write some bad stuff in order to get to the good stuff. He calls it dreck. And a lot of times people just are not willing to deal with the dreck. Another quote that I like is be like water. Be like water comes from Bruce Lee. And the idea is that, if you watch water flowing down a hill or flowing down a bunch of rocks, right? What does the water do? It sees a rock or it sees a little bump and it just goes around it. And so this concept that we want to be like water, we want to be able to be flexible, we want to be able to go with the flow. And another concept is that we just want to be able to have this concept of relentless forward progress so we can get to where we want to go and nail the outcome. So that's the topic that we're going to cover today, is how to deal with obstacles and why they're important in many ways in that journey that we have. So a couple of thoughts and comments that I've got here. And of course, I've got some strategies at the end of this that have worked for me. And hopefully here, there's something that will work for you. One thing I do want to ask, which I haven't been asking in the other episodes, is that as now that we're cranking along with this Go Farther series, if there's something in this episode or other episodes that you think are helpful for other people besides yourself, I would absolutely love it and appreciate it if you could forward this podcast episode to them, ask a friend or 10 to check out this episode or to follow the show. I'm doing this because I feel like there's things that I've learned that might be helpful for other folks. And if you're already listening, there's probably other people that have never heard about me or never heard about this podcast. And so having people follow the show is great for us because it gives me more motivation to keep cranking out these episodes. And it also just helps get the word out to other folks. Plus, in this podcast that I've been doing now for 7 years, there's now hundreds of episodes related to startups and selling and other things that might also be helpful besides this single episode. So I do ask that you share this episode with a friend or 10 if you would. So let's talk about obstacles and why they're good. Well, I think the first thing about obstacles is that for me, it just tells me I'm doing something hard. I'm doing something difficult, right? If something's really easy, if I remember playing with my son when he was very young and, he was 2 or 3 years old, and there's these little puzzles that you can get. They might be 8-piece puzzles, right? Putting together an 8-piece puzzle is pretty easy if you're an adult. It's like not very hard. It gets boring after a while. The kid wants to do it over and over and over because it's hard for them. But for you as an adult, I mean, there's many moments where if you've had a small child or have a small child, it's sort of, for you in your brain, you're like, God, like how many times you're going to read this story or how many times you're going to do this puzzle over and over and over because it's just boring after a while, right? And so I think about obstacles as telling me it's like an indicator, it's a signal that I'm on the right path. There's a book by Ryan Holiday called The Obstacle is the Way. And the book is just about how important it is to find obstacles as you're moving forward. On the racing side of things, when it comes to obstacles, I've got a friend of mine from the racing world that I've known for probably about 15 years. Her name's Carrie, and Carrie's a phenomenal athlete. When I started doing triathlons back in 2008, 2009, I met Carrie out here in Davis, California, and she had already done a couple of Ironman triathlons. She had actually qualified for her age group for the World Championships out in Hawaii, which is extremely difficult. Like you have to be a top amateur. The way that the Hawaiian Ironman triathlon works, the World Championships, is that you have to run a qualifying Ironman, and then you have to finish usually top of your age group or the top two or three, particularly for women in her age group. You have to finish, you have to be super fast. You have to be among the fastest women in the world in order to get a spot to go to Hawaii. And she'd actually done this race a couple of times. In fact, the first time that she qualified for the Ironman triathlon, she broke her collarbone about a month before the race. And, after spending years training, getting into this race, she was completely undeterred and ended up doing the race anyway, basically swimming on one arm of recovering broken collarbone. I mean, this woman is tough and she is strong and she is undeterred by obstacles. And the community out here in Davis is pretty small. We had a triathlon club back then, and so every once in a while I'd get a chance to go on a ride with her, a training ride. We'd sometimes get a small group of anywhere from 2 to 5 people just to go out riding together on the bike. And I remember a couple of things that she used to tell me. I call them Carrieisms when it comes to obstacles. She told me once, no matter how good you feel or no matter how bad you feel in a race, it'll never last. No matter how good or how bad you feel in a race, it'll never last. And it took me a little while to figure that out, especially as I was just moving into longer and longer races, because there are moments in a long race, it could be in the middle of the race, or it could be in the beginning of the race where you're feeling really good. You're feeling strong, nutrition's working, hydration's working, it's not too hot out. Maybe you came out of the water after the swim and you're feeling strong, and you hop on the bike and you're feeling strong, and that first climb didn't feel like much of a climb, and you're feeling good, right? But then at some point in the race, especially if you're doing a long, long distance race, if you're doing an Ironman, you're going to be out there 12, 13, 14 hours. If you're doing an ultra marathon, you could be anywhere from 6 hours to 24 plus hours. You're not going to feel good every step along the way. There's going to be some times where you're going to feel bad. On the flip side, those times where you're feeling bad are normal. Those are just low spots. You have to expect that. And the thing about her advice to me was like, when you're feeling bad, it's okay. Just kind of keep cranking through, just keep moving forward. And eventually you'll start to feel good again. So no matter how good you feel or no matter how bad you feel, it'll never last. And a caveat to that, what she said is run your perfect race. No matter what happens, run your perfect race, meaning that if you're feeling good, stay true to yourself, keep moving forward, take advantage of those times without overcooking yourself. But when you're feeling bad, manage it and just know that, hey, if I'm managing this bad time, I'm still going to run as well as possible. I'm still going to race as well as possible, even if I'm not feeling bad. So those two Carrieisms have always stuck with me when it comes to obstacles. A couple of other examples when I think about racing, and I've also got some business examples here that I'll share in a couple minutes. There's another long distance race. It's this crazy, crazy ultra marathon. I've never done this race. There was a time, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe a little bit longer ago, where I thought I wanted to do this race. And, part of me still kind of does, but it's kind of past for me, which is called the Barkley Marathon, the Barkley Marathons. So the Barkley Marathons, you may have heard about this race. There's been a couple of good documentaries that have come out recently about this race. The short of it is there's a guy in Tennessee, and what he did is he basically built this crazy endurance race, and there's 5 loops to this race. Each one of those loops are anywhere from 20 to 25 miles. The reason it's anywhere from 20 to 25 is that he doesn't actually tell you what the course is. So there's 35 runners that are accepted into this race, and you have 60 hours to complete 5 loops. The course is not set until the day before the race. So the runners show up and then they're given a map, a physical map of the course. And from there, you have to orienteer your way through this course through the mountains in Tennessee. There's checkpoints along the way where you have to grab a page out of a book to verify that you've been to that checkpoint. I think there's something like 13 or 15 checkpoints along that 20 or 25-mile loop. So you have to finish that loop and then get back to the starting point, verify that, yes, you've completed all the checkpoints, and then you can go again into the next loop and the next and the next. So they've been running this race since 1986. So you can do the math on that. It's basically like what, 40 years to 96. Yeah. So about 40 years have been running this race. And in the course of this race, I think there's only been about 25 people to ever finish all five loops. Right. So it's this crazy, crazy race. You can check it out called the Barkley Marathons. But what's really, really interesting about this when it comes to obstacles is that there are three men that have completed this race more than once. So there's only three people that have actually done it two or more times. There's a guy named Brett Main. There's a guy named Jason Campbell who's actually done it three times. So Brett Main's done it twice. Jason Campbell's finished it three times, 3 different years. And there's a guy named John Kelly that's finished it twice. And so when I was first interested in this race about, I don't know, like I said, 5 or 6 years ago, I met another runner through a friend of mine, a guy named Christian Griffith. And Christian was introduced to me because he was running across the United States as a fundraiser. So he was running from the East Coast to the West Coast. And a friend of mine said, hey, you should hook up with Christian when he's coming through California. And so hooked up with him and his race organizer or his run organizer. And I said, hey, when you're coming through Northern California, let me know. I can run some miles with you. So we did. And I remember talking to him about the Barkley Marathon, and he had actually been accepted to the Barkley, and he had done one lap, and he was only able to complete one lap. He had gone back a second time, and he actually paced a blind woman who wanted to do the race. She was accepted into the race. And so like he's had experience, direct experience with this race. And we got talking about this race. And I said to him, I said, I've done a lot of research around this race. And it feels like to me, the one main component of give yourself a chance of completing this race is that you need to remove variables. And what I mean by that is like you have to be super, super fit, first of all, because you're running through 20,000 feet of elevation climb per loop. So your fitness has to be great. You need to make sure you're really dialed in with nutrition and calories and hydration. You need to make sure you're prepared for the elements. This race is in March in Tennessee. So sometimes it can be actually quite warm. Other times it can be super cold and even snowy, right? You need to be really skilled at orienteering. So when you have a map, you know, and a compass, you know what direction you're going. So you need to kind of remove variables so that when the other obstacles come up, like maybe you do get lost, or maybe you get disoriented, or maybe because of lack of sleep, you start to realize you're hallucinating, that you've got all of your mental energy that can focus on that obstacle that has popped up. And he kind of laughed. He said, yeah, that's basically it. And so I go back to those three different men that have completed this race more than once. The thing that's most interesting to me is all three of them are scientists. One is an astrophysicist, another is a mechanical engineer, and a third is a data scientist, is a PhD from Carnegie Mellon. And so you think about the ability to navigate that kind of course. It's a very like you almost imagine it being a scientific approach where you have to go in prepared. You have to go in to be able to problem solve because you're not going to have a perfect race, right? Not everything is going to go well. You're going to hit multiple obstacles along the way. And the ability to problem solve when those obstacles hit in a logical, rational way is really the difference between somebody who can keep moving forward and complete the loops and potentially complete the race and people that don't. And so this is where obviously planning matters, but also just the ability to isolate down and be able to focus on one obstacle at a time. Related to this concept, I'll talk a little bit more about racing before we get into a couple of business applications here. You know, there's this concept of known unknowns. Well, there's no knowns. So there's things that if I'm going into any difficult endeavor, you know, I'm starting a company, I'm launching a product, I'm going through a hiring process, I'm trying to grow revenue from $1 million to $3 million this year. There's things that we know. There's no knowns. Then there are the known unknowns. And then, so those are the things that we don't know. And then there's the unknown unknowns. They're the things that we don't know, right? This quote is sort of made famous by Donald Rumsfeld years ago, is absolutely relevant when it comes to doing hard things, right? And so when I think about my personal race planning, if I'm going into an ultra marathon, there are known knowns, right? I know the course is 100 miles. I know, generally what the elevation climbs are going to be. I'm looking for ways to, get a feel for what the weather is probably going to be like. I'll read race reports from other people that have done it in the past. I'll absorb all the information that I can, just so I know everything that there is to know about that race. But then there are the known unknowns. So even if you're looking at an elevation chart, so most races will show you the ups and downs. It'll show you, okay, there's a climb here, and then that goes up for 5 miles, and then there's a descent for 3 miles, and then it's kind of up and down, and then you'll go up another big climb that climbs for 3,000 feet, and then over 5 miles, and then you'll be back down again. You have a sense for what that looks like. That's a known known. But the known unknowns might be like how steep are the pitches in there. You can make some estimates to say, okay, if it's 3,000 feet of a climb over 5 miles, that's about 600 feet per mile. And I've done enough training to know, okay, I know what the relative steepness is if I'm going up 600 feet over the course of a mile because I've done enough training. There's other pitches that might be 1,000 feet per mile, which are much steeper. And I've done training on that. I'm like, okay, now I have like a mental model and experience for what can I expect and what should my speed be? Like if I'm climbing, I know myself, if I'm climbing up 500 or 600 feet in elevation gain over 1 mile, I can probably do about a 15 to 18 minute mile, right? That's the pace at which I could go. Now, if it's 1,000 feet climb in 1 mile, I know that's going to drop down to 20 to 25 minutes per mile. So that kind of bits of information, that's the known knowns, allow me to estimate my time. But what I don't necessarily know by looking at a picture, a drawing on a piece of paper about an elevation is like, how is that steepness going to change? How is the terrain itself? Is the course really rocky? Is it loose gravel that's going to be hard to climb up? Is it really rooty, meaning there's lots of roots? Is the course itself, is it tree covered where there's shade? Or are there no trees in those different climbs? Because if I'm going to be going up a 3,000-foot climb in the middle of the day and the race is in Bryce Canyon in the desert, I know there's not going to be any tree cover. And if it's in the middle of the day in Bryce Canyon at the end of May, I can expect it to be 90 degrees. That's going to be a pretty tough climb. So I need to prepare for those things. But I don't always know those things going in. So you have to prepare for that. The other known unknown might be the weather. I just mentioned Bryce Canyon. So there's a Bryce Canyon 100 that I did back in 2019. And that race was the end of May. Bryce Canyon's in Utah. It's in the desert. And most of the race is around anywhere from 7 to 9,000 feet. So it's up in the air. You've got some elevation, but it's also in the desert at the end of May in Utah. So you would expect the weather to be hot. Not for my race. For my race, it was cold. We started the race, it was like 28 degrees. And in the middle of the day, it started snowing up there in the mountains. And so you're like, wow, okay, I expected it to be hot, but the weather pattern actually changed a couple of days beforehand. And instead, it was really cold. So there's some known unknowns, some things that you might not necessarily be able to prepare for. And then there's the unknowns, the things that you don't necessarily know are going to happen. And those are the things that you can't necessarily prepare for. But if you are prepared to remove the other variables, if, for example, I know the weather could change, so I have extra gear with me if it's cold. If I know it's going to be hot, then I can make sure I have enough water and salt and nutrition to make sure that I don't overcook myself. I can slow down my pace. But that allows me to then focus on the unknowns that might crop up. Maybe it's a course change, or maybe this hill used to be covered with trees, but there was a forest fire and the forest fire stripped all of the tree cover. And now it's middle of the day and it's covered. It's not covered and it's really, really hot, right? So these are all the things that can happen. And so you're having to deal with these various obstacles as you're going along. And the key, of course, like I said, is you have to sort of deal with the negativity. You have to be like water, as I said, and just kind of go with the flow. But you also have to remember to keep that relentless forward progress. Or as one of the Careyisms is like, no matter how good or no matter how bad you feel, you want to run your perfect race. So when I think about this and a couple of business examples, I think are important, and then I'll get into some strategies here. Like think about yourself, like you're running your business and what are some obstacles that come up for you? One might be that you find out you're at high risk of losing one of your top customers. So as a startup, you might land that hallmark customer early in your life. It's great to have that big logo. It's great to have that big account. Maybe they're pumping lots of revenue, and that's a large percentage of the revenue coming into your company. And I've seen this with clients that we coach where, we've had, like, I have a company that I worked with that had a significant financial institution that accounted for more than 50% of their run rate revenue. Now they're working like mad trying to add more customers, add more logos so they can diversify away. But in the early stage, if you're under a couple $1 million in revenue, that one big customer is great to have, but it's also really scary to have. And so they found out that this customer was planning to leave and was planning to discontinue the contract instead of renewing. And so what do you do there? Right? That's a huge obstacle that you have to deal with. And that's something that might well happen with you. A second example might be that you're out there hiring. You're trying to find an account executive. You're trying to find a VP of sales or a head of sales, right? And let's say you hire that person and 2 months in, 3 months in, 6 months in, you realize, wow, I made a bad hire, right? I made a bad decision. I either hired the wrong person, I hired for the wrong role, or both. And now you're stuck with this major obstacle. What do I do? Because now I've lost this time. I've lost 2 months or 3 months or 6 months or more. I've lost this money that I've been spending. Now I've got to figure out, how do I either repurpose this person? How do I figure out if this is recoverable? Can I get this person to perform if they're not performing? Or do I need to let this person go, knowing that it may take me another 2 or 3 months just to hire somebody else new to take that place? And now that person's going to take another 2 or 3 months to get up to speed. I add all that up, and I've lost an entire year, an entire 12 months of my revenue growth. I've lost 12 months of runway. I've lost 12 months of money I've been spending to have this person in this role, right? And these things can happen. So how are you going to deal with this? And then there's other things that just happen with your team every day. There's life that happens, right? You might find out that a key team member is like, hey, got some news for you. We're going to have a baby. So I need to go on maternity leave, or I need to go on paternity leave. And that might not be so bad if you have some notice and you can account for that. But if it's a key person that is going to be leaving your team for an extended period of time, like, you've got to deal with that obstacle, right? You might deal with other things. Obviously, people could get COVID or colds or flus. Like, I just came back from a conference and I left Las Vegas with a cold. But what if, I mean, I had a meeting, my very first meeting that was set up for that conference on Monday morning at 7:30 in the morning. I was supposed to have a breakfast meeting with a bank executive. And that morning, the guy sends me an email first thing in the morning. He's like, look, man, bad news. I got a stomach bug and I'm stuck in my hotel. Like, I cannot meet, right? That can happen. Well, what if that happens to one of your team members? What if you and your team member were lined up all these meetings, and your team member a day before the conference is like, dude, I got bad news. Like, I'm in bed. I got the flu. I can't travel. Then what do? You've got to be able to make some adjustments. You've got to be able to deal with that obstacle. And these are probably have all happened to you at some point if you're running a company or managing a team. Or similarly, it might not be you or your team member, but what if something happens to your parents or your loved ones and you've got to care for them? I got a phone call from my mom over the weekend or on Friday. She's like, hey, got to let you know, dad's going into the hospital. Turns out he has an infected gallbladder. He's got to have his gallbladder removed. I'm like, okay, well, my dad's in his 70s and it's supposed to be routine surgery, but what if it's not routine surgery? What if it turns into something more? And my first thought when I got that phone call with my mom is, okay, do you need me to get on a plane? Do I need to fly from California to New Jersey? Can I help you with recovery? Can I help you with what's going to happen? And now all of a sudden while I've had a full week plan of being at home after traveling, maybe I got to hop on a plane. And now my might have to do more at home after she's already had to do a bunch when I was away last week. Now, fortunately, good news is dad's home and recovering and doing great. But those are like little things that pop up, not so little things that pop up as obstacles. And then lastly, just think about things that are out of your control, like the market shifts. We talked about this. 2021, rate for funding. Everything's going up into the right. 2022, 2023, not so much, not good for funding. So maybe that runway that you're planning to you're planning to close a seed round or planning to close a Series A. Now, all of a sudden, you don't get that funding. You've got to extend runway. You've got to remove some team members. You got to adjust your strategy. Those are pretty big obstacles. And on top of that, maybe the demand for your product has been reduced. So, we've seen this with some clients I'm consulting to with right now, selling to banks, selling to financial institutions, selling to insurance companies. Like many of the banks, like I've literally talked to three different like major executives at major banks at this conference. Now I'm recording this podcast. It's March 11th, right? These bank executives last week have literally said, we are still waiting for our 2024 budgets. It's March. It's almost the end of Q1. And some of these banks are still haven't released 2024 budgets. Now, usually in banks, budgets get set back in September, October of the previous year. There's budget season where bank execs and their divisions, they put in for their 2024 budgets in the end of Q3, beginning of Q4. Those budget requests get disseminated, and then those budgets get set, and that money is doled out by early January. But last year was a hard year for a lot of banks. Profitability was down. A lot of banks had some major expenses unexpected when the FDIC required certain large banks to put more money into the FDIC. Sometimes upwards, like Wells Fargo had to put $1.9 billion into this expense for FDIC that they didn't expect. So now banks like that are just readjusting everything. And so now there are banks that this client was expecting to add as a new customer in Q1. We're already talking about contracts, had already done paid pilots. Now all of a sudden those conversations are getting delayed. These are obstacles that are out of your control, right? So any of these things can happen, and they do happen, and they could be small scale things too, right? I'm a planner. I've talked about how I plan my day, I plan my week, I color code my calendar, I set out time when I'm going to exercise, I set out time for certain functions, I set out this time Monday mornings to record these podcasts. Well, there's little things that can deter your day. What if all of a sudden a client says, look, man, like I really need some time from you. And that time block was exactly the same time block I was planning to exercise, and the rest of my day is full. I've got other meetings, I've got dog walk to do, I've got soccer practice that night, I've got to get dinner on the table after soccer practice. All of now the rest of my day is full. When am I going to exercise? It might seem like a small thing, but it's something that's critical to me each and every day to get some time exercising. Or you get the phone call from school. Oh, your son hit his head. I had this last week. My son was at recess. He was roughhousing with his friends, as is normal, and got pushed into a wall, banged his head into a wall. And now they're like, well, it's a head injury, so you got to come pick him up. It's like, man, okay. That was right during the time I was supposed to have a meeting. So now what do? I have to adjust my day. Or you get the sick kid, same thing. My son 2 weeks ago, sniffling, coughing, getting progressively worse over the weekend. And then Monday rolls around and like, man, you just can't go to school today. And now I've got a son that's home from school all day. It's okay when he's 12 years old because he can kind of self-manage. But what happens if it's a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, right? You got to keep the kid home from preschool for a couple of days. So these things happen. But internet outages, we get some pretty heavy winds around here sometimes when the seasons change, especially in the winter or in the fall. And sometimes the internet goes out, and I'm like sitting here going like, crap, the internet's out. I got 4 Zoom calls. What am I going to do? How am I going to handle this? I don't get a good enough signal with my phone where I can manage Zoom on my phone. So what do? I've got to be able to respond to that. So these are, all of the little obstacles that pop up along the way. So what I want to do here now is share a couple of strategies. I've got 5 here that I think will help you manage these obstacles and help you run your perfect race. Okay. Strategy number 1. And remember what we're trying to do here. I want to help you go farther. I want to help you do more. I want to help you be happy. I want you to surprise yourself. And so when these obstacles come up and you've got to run your perfect race, these are a couple things that might be helpful for you. So the first one is the concept of the hero's journey. So this is a concept that was really popularized by a guy named Joseph Campbell. And basically what Joseph Campbell did is he studied mythology and folklore from all over the world. And what he found is that most stories involve what's called the hero's journey. You might be familiar with this. And the idea of the hero's journey is that in a story, the hero of the story typically has to go through three trials or three obstacles or three tribulations along the way. So most great stories are built around this hero's journey. Well, think about Star Wars, how, Luke Skywalker has to overcome these obstacles along the way. Or think about, Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings. Any of these great stories all come with obstacles that the hero has to deal with. And while it's a concept in mythology, it's a concept in storytelling or folklore, I think it rings true for all of us in imagining ourselves in our own way, in our own hero's journey. And so when I think about how do I apply that to obstacles that might come up, it's almost expecting that there are going to be obstacles. If I'm on this journey, for example, if I'm on a race and I've done my best to remove variables, I've got good diet, nutrition, I've got hydration, I've got gear, I've planned out the race, I've done as much course research as I can, I've got pacers that are going to help me along the way, I've got aid bags that are going to be with me at different rest stops. I just come to accept that, okay, around this race, there's probably going to be at least three things that are going to go wrong. There's going to be three things that will be unexpected. I've accounted for all the things I know that I can handle, but there's going to be three things that are going to pop up. And by setting that up for myself, instead of just thinking I've accounted for everything and this race is going to be perfect, if instead I go in expecting these unexpected things to pop up, it helps me deal with those at any given time. So I remember one time doing a race down in New Zealand called the Tarawera 100-mile race in New Zealand. And one of the things that most of these races allow you to do is prepare what's called an aid bag. So it's just a small bag. You can add food or change of clothes or shoes or whatever you want in this aid bag. And so I usually keep them pretty light. I usually just add use this nutrition stuff called Tailwind, which is really just sugar to give you energy. I usually throw a little extra food. I might throw a pair of socks or a change or a shirt or something like that. And as part of my race plan, that way I don't have to carry as much stuff with me in my backpack. It keeps my pack lighter. That way when I get to an aid station, I can just swap out empty bags for the new stuff and just kind of keep moving forward. Well, I remember getting to an aid station and they have all of the aid bags by your bib number and mine's not there. And I'm talking to the organizer and she's like, I don't know, sometimes they don't get here. And they tell you that at the race. They're like, we do our very best to get these aid bags here, but sometimes they go missing or sometimes they get sent to the wrong place. It happens. It's just like lost luggage with an airline. And so I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, like this sucks. And for a moment, I was kind of like, okay, what am I going to do? But then I realized like, okay, this is fine because I got another aid bag down the road at another aid station. I still have some leftover stuff. There is food and nutrition at this aid station. But even better, somebody overheard that I was going through this. They were going through their aid bag. And this other racer heard me say, and like, I was kind of depending on this for my nutrition. And he literally said, I have an extra Tailwind. Do you want to just take mine? And he handed me this giant bag of Tailwind. I was like, oh, no reason to panic. Problem solved. So just expecting those things to happen helps you keep calm and helps you deal with that situation. I've had, the same thing with races when it comes to heat. I talked about the weather at Bryce Canyon or when I ran the Western States 100. It was supposed to be kind of a nice day, not too hot, but as the last day or two going into the race, the weather pattern changed. And there were some days, some points in that course on race day was over 100 degrees, like over 100 degrees going through these canyons in Auburn, California, man. It is freaking hot, right? So again, just saying, well, wasn't expecting this. I mean, I kind of knew it was going to be hot that day, but until you actually feel it out there at mile 50, going up a climb that's exposed in 100-degree heat, you're just like, okay, this is what I have to deal with. But again, just saying like, okay, this is just one of those things I expect is an obstacle that I didn't necessarily expect, but because I didn't expect it, now I have expected the unexpected. So now I can just deal with it in the moment. So just imagine yourself, at least this is what works for me. I just kind of imagine myself on this hero's journey. And part of the challenge is that I'm going to run up against these obstacles or these trials or these tribulations that I'm going to have to work myself through and problem solve. This then relates to a second strategy related to this is I always think of myself as, a character in a story. So when I'm doing these races or I'm doing things at work, I try to almost extricate myself out because I do like after a race, I'll oftentimes do a race report and I'll kind of tell the story of the race. What did I do and what were the conditions and how did I manage things and who did I meet? And just it's a way for me to catalog for myself and remember years down the road that I did this race and what did I go through and remember all the details that I'm otherwise going to forget. And so sometimes if I'm in this race, I will imagine myself as a character in the story. And so the strategy here for me is just to remember this is part of the story. And that when I'm done and I've overcome these obstacles and I get to that finish line, it's going to make for a really good story. It's going to be entertaining. It's going to be something I'm going to feel proud of. It's going to be something I can tell my friends about. And then they're going to kind of shake their head and be like, man, you're crazy that you go out and do those things. And so just kind of removing yourself out of the situation, whether it's a business situation where in that moment you're feeling like, God, like, what am I going to do? I just found out my VP of sales is going to quit, or I just, come to the realization that I've got to let this person go. Take yourself out of that moment a little bit and kind of look at it from the third person and say, okay, that's fine. Look at this obstacle. You're going to figure a way around it because you've solved other problems before. And when this is all said and done, whether you end up succeeding or not succeeding, hitting your expectations or not hitting your expectations, it's going to make for a good story. You're going to learn something from it that you can share with other people. You're going to learn something from it that you can use and apply down the road. Some of my best lessons have come from failed races. I've had cases where I've dropped out of races before. And the reason I dropped out of races was because maybe I wasn't prepared enough, or maybe because I wasn't expecting certain obstacles. What can I do to learn from that the next time around? So that strategy for me just kind of helps me remove myself and allows me to think in a different sort of different mindset or a different style. The third strategy is just to ask yourself, what's in my control? Like, what's in my control? What can I do about this? And what can't I do about this? Right. And it's just kind of the classic, like you can moan and complain, or you can just do something about it. So for me, right, I get to that aid station, my aid bag's not there. Right. Is that in my control? I can't get in a time machine. I can't go to the person that was supposed to load the bag into the truck that was going to take it to that aid station and say, hey, make sure you get my bag. Right. That's not in my control. But what is in my control is how I respond to it. What is in my control is how do I be resourceful and realize to myself, okay, I've still got some extra stuff in my bag that I haven't used. There's still plenty of place and plenty of food and nutrition here at this aid station. The next one is only 10 miles down the road, 10 miles down the trail. I'm going to be fine. So these things are in my control, right? I can't control the weather. I couldn't control it was going to be 100 degrees plus that day. But what I can control is, well, how do I slow down my pace? How do I make sure I'm taking a little extra salt and water? How do I relish this in some regards and tell myself like this is going to make for a hell of a good story because I have trained in 100-degree heat before. I have climbed this climb before. I know what this feels like. I'm accepting is going to be here. Like it's in my control to just go a little slower, be a little smarter with nutrition, with hydration, with salt, and just get to the top of this climb and then reset from there. Right. So what's in my control? If somebody's going to quit or I need to let somebody go, what's in my control? Well, what's in my control is starting to block time in my calendar to recruit again. Every Friday in the afternoon, I'm going to go on LinkedIn and start recruiting for another VP of sales. I'm going to go contact other recruiters instead of me doing the hiring on my own. While it might be an investment and expense I'll have to take on to hire a recruiter, it's in my control to maybe offload that and get some help on it. Those are things that are in my control. I can take action now, right? So that's a third strategy. Just ask yourself what's in your control and take that kind of inventory and then act on that piece that is in your control. Fourth strategy is actually related to taking action. So there's this concept in wilderness survival, and there's different frameworks, but the one that kind of stuck with me is this idea of like this 4-step process, which is when you hit an obstacle, number one is accept it. Accept it as here. Like accept reality. You can't deny it. You can't ignore it. You have to accept the reality. Okay, I need to let this person go, or I don't have my nutrition, or my kid is going to be home from school today. There's nothing I can do about this. So just accept it. The second thing we want to do is assess or analyze. Okay, now that I've accepted this to be the situation, what are my options? What's in my control? What are some things that I can do? What are some things that are just not things that are available to me? Just kind of get a sense for like, even if I have to physically write things down on paper, okay, what are some things that I can control? What are some things that I can't control? Just again, remove yourself from the situation as if you were almost consulting with somebody else that was in that situation. If you had a friend that said, hey, like, God, man, like, I'm supposed to have a busy day at work and now my kid's home from school. I don't know what to do. What advice would you give that person to like, okay, chill out. Like, here, what are your options? What are some things you can do? Can you move some meetings around? Can you have other people take these meetings? Is there somebody, a neighbor or something that might be willing to come over and maybe help out for a little bit? What if that kid is younger and they're gonna take some nap time? Is there something you can do in there? Give advice to yourself, analyze or assess the situation. The third step is then start to adapt and take those actions. Like, okay, cool. Well, I've got these 4 meetings lined up, and the second one, that's probably one I can move. It's a meeting that I have with a client, and we meet every 2 weeks, but it's not urgent. If I just ask that client that I've had for a while, like, hey, listen, got a sick kid. Okay, if we move to tomorrow, okay to move to later in the week. Is that cool? Chances are they'll be like, yeah. And what's funny about this is sometimes when I make those requests to move a meeting, not always, but sometimes I get the response back like, oh, that me. Like, how many times is that where the person has said to you, you know what, that works great. That actually works better for me. So you're sort of like, oh, phew, okay, cool. So this obstacle turned out to be a good thing for both of us. And then the last thing you gotta do is take action, right? You can't be paralyzed. You can't just sit there. Once you've accepted the situation, you've assessed and analyzed it, you figured out how to adapt, then take those actions. It's like, okay, I got a sick kid at home. I gotta take 30 minutes right now to reallocate my day, to move things around and just do the best I can. And throughout the course of the day, just accept that you might have more things happen. You might have expected your sick kid to sleep and take a nap from 1 to 3, because that's usually when they take a nap. But because they're sick, they can't take a nap. They're not feeling well. They're crying. They need to be coddled. They need that comfort. It's okay. Like, accept it, analyze, adapt, and act on that one situation. It just helps me to sort of manage that situation and identify that there's usually solutions to the problem. There's an idea that I learned from Tara Brach. So Tara Brach is a expert in meditation, and she's written a couple of really good books. One is called Radical Acceptance, and several others. And there's something that she talks about, which is this concept of Mara. So Mara is like this evil demon that pops up and shows itself whenever you're trying to do something. And the concept that she talks about is to say, hello, Mara, I've been expecting you. Let's have tea. Hello, Mara, I've been expecting you. Let's have tea. And I've used this. I've actually used this in my brain when I'm on a race course and something pops up. I get cramps or something else happens and or my stomach's not right. I'm like, okay, I knew something wrong was going to happen. This is Mara showing up. Good to see you. I've been expecting you. Let's have tea, and just accept it and bring it in. And it allows you to just sort of deal with it as opposed to trying to push it away in denial. So that's the 4th strategy: accept, assess, adapt, and act. And then the last thing that I cannot stress this one enough, and I'm guilty of this as anyone. I'm the kind of person that likes to solve my own problems. I don't want to, burden other people. I know other people are busy. They've got their stuff going on. I don't want to be that guy that's asking for help. But at the end of the day, ask for help. Ask for help when something comes up. If you have an obstacle, if you have an obstruction, you need to get help. Even if it's just like picking up the phone or texting a couple friends and say, I've got a couple of people in my network that I use all the time. Now I've gotten much, much better about this in the last year or two, where I'll say, Jason Bay, for example, is a really, really good friend of mine. He's coaching our program. He and I talk about once every 4 to 6 weeks. We just set up a call on a Friday and we just jam and talk about business. But there's situations where I'm like, man, this one's pretty tough. I'm like, hey, Jason, listen, I got this situation. Can you grab 30 minutes? Or, hey, man, if you got a few minutes, can you text me back with a few ideas? And he'll do it. I've got other friends like Amy Volas over at Avenue Talent Partners. She does recruitment for startups. Same thing. I know I can trust her. I know I can ask her for help. I've got other folks like this where I'm just like, hey, man, can I grab a few minutes? Or, hey, could you really use some help and some advice? And they're like, sure. And it may not be today or tomorrow because their schedules are busy, but I know that they will be willing to give me advice. And just knowing that that time might be on the calendar in a day or two just gives me the ability to feel calm. Like, okay, I'm going to get help on this. And by the time that I even do that call, sometimes the situation has resolved itself, but it's something I know I can do. And the same with my wife. She doesn't work in my business day to day, but she obviously understands it enough. I had this last night, Sunday night. I had a call from a client. I usually do stuff on the weekends, but client needs help and sends me a text. I'm like, all right, man, let's hop on a call. And so he's explaining the situation to me and where he needs help. And so I was like, okay, let me work on this. Let me get back to you tomorrow. Now I understand the situation. And so first thing I did, first person that's available to me to get help is my wife. And I just, we're sitting down over dinner and I say, all right, here's what happened. I got this call. This is the situation. I'm kind of thinking through it this way or that way. And she's able to give me advice and say, yeah, like, I think this part sounds good, or I'm not sure about that part. Like, it sounds like you need to get some more information on that. So you don't have to internalize everything. Yeah, being a hero on your journey, sometimes we feel like we have to go at it on our own with our sword and our shield and slay the dragon. And there are situations at the end of the day, like, yeah, we need to own the action. We need to own the repercussions. We need to own taking action. But it doesn't mean you can't ask for help, because more than likely there's going to be somebody out there that will ask you for or be able to help you with. So that's it. Obstacles. Run your perfect race. No matter what happens, run your perfect race. So hopefully this is just a set of strategies, just to acknowledge, like, look, obstacles are going to happen. Obstacles are a good thing. It tells you you're on the path. You're doing something hard. Expect those things to happen. And then when they do happen, hopefully some of these strategies will help you to do more, be happy, and surprise yourself. Go farther.